Hey friends, you're watching BrainStormAcres. I'm Henry.
And I'm Irene.
We're taking a break from our work on the greenhouse, mostly Irene's work on the greenhouse, to answer a question that has come up for the time that caused me to want to do this.
Okay.
The question is, what's our background? Well, I grew up in Maine. Irene grew up in Long Island, and one of the things to keep in mind is we're talking about 50, 60 years ago and longer. So what you see in Maine or you see in New York is no longer what it was then.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's still places like where I grew up, really. I mean, I grew up in not suburbia when I was little, but then suburbia when I was, junior high school and up. But there are still plenty of rural areas in Long Island, and I spent most of my time there, in the rural areas, and that's the areas I preferred. I was not much of a suburban kid.
Well, there's no big lie there then.
No, they put in the Long Island Expressway when I was in elementary school, I think.
And when I was a kid, there was no Maine Turnpike.
Right.
If you were going to go to Massachusetts, you were going to take Route 1.
Mm-hmm. Which is really pretty, and it's still, we've driven pieces of it just because it's pretty. Little rundown in spots, touristy in others, nice vistas. It's some rough areas because you drive through some of the industrial areas, but, it's much more informative about life than, the paved 6-lane highways that you don't see anything but trees on the sides.
Yeah, I grew up in Brunswick, Maine. I graduated from Brunswick High School in 1972.
Mm-hmm.
My family lived on a street 2 blocks from Main Street. And the property behind us was all woods. There was a railroad track, great place to live. My father cut wood with a chainsaw, and my brother and sister and I hauled it by hand, mostly me, with a cement bucket, and stacked it in the sand cellar for winter use. So it was great. We heated the house for a long time with a Franklin fireplace. And you grew up in a different environment.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the first house I remember, which was not the first house my parents had, was a house that my father had designed. He was an architect, and he designed a ranch house, and it was on a half an acre in a new subdivision out in the middle of the pucky brush that they just sort of plopped down out there in farm country. And as a child, it was fine. As an adult, I look back and go, it was poorly designed. I find that architects are not always practical about what works and what doesn't, and my mother would have been useless in terms of providing help about what she really needed for storage or anything like that, because she grew up in Queens. She grew up in areas where you went to the grocery store every day, the same way as you would if you lived in lots of places in Europe, where you just literally walk to your local grocery, and you buy things fresh, and you don't have a giant fridge, and you don't have, and that's the kind of environment she grew up in.
Yeah, that's the borough of Queens in New York.
Yeah. So, I thought it was a great place to live as a kid because there was plenty of space, and chipmunks and squirrels and bunny rabbits and, that sort of stuff. And then we moved to suburbia in Wantagh.
That was really suburbia.
Yeah, that was suburbia. It had been suburbia since right after World War II, when they built all the houses for the returning troops, basically. And my parents had lived there right after World War II. They bought a place in a different part of town, little teeny tiny houses, little ticky-tacky houses,
but affordable.
But affordable. And then we bought a house that had been built already. When we moved there, it cut my dad's commute in half, so it totally made sense. And my mom didn't like living in the country either.
Now your dad was commuting to New York City.
Right, he was taking the Long Island Railroad into the city every day, so he just could walk like 4 blocks, long blocks, but still 4 blocks up to the railroad station, and take the train. So it was an hour commute from there, whereas it had been 2 hours from where my parents lived before.
Yeah. Irene's a little older than me. She was 2 years ahead of me in high school.
Yeah, I graduated in 70.
And I graduated in 72. We met in college at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina.
Right, right. Slinging hash in the cafeteria.
And feeding the commercial garbage disposal for the stuff coming off the students' plates.
Yeah, scraping plates. Very
Yeah,
exciting.
You don't have a whole lot of pretense possible when you're up to your elbows in
Somebody
gunk.
else's lunch. Yeah. Yeah, we both worked in the cafeteria, which is where we met. And because I needed a buck, my parents were not providing enough change.
Well, the funny thing was that colleges then had a suggested budget for students. And I remember very clearly that
It had nothing to do with reality.
in I think my second year, I had a budget of I think $150 for textbooks, and ironically enough, one textbook for one class was $125.
Well, I remember going my very first semester, and my parents had we had a bank account, and I had an allowance for the semester, and I spent every dime of it just on books. And I had to call my parents and say, "Hey, look, you know that money you gave me for the semester?
Gone."
That just covered books, barely. You know, and that won't cover extra pencils for next week, you know." So it was a bit, the budget that they gave was really wrong. And I guess it was my sophomore year I started working in the cafeteria because I wanted more money. I was tired of scraping along. We went to school. Unfortunately, it was an expensive school back then. Very good school. But a lot of the kids who went there were senators' children and stuff like that. So you're talking about kids who had, $100 a week allowance in 1972.
So it was a really good school. It was definitely an intellectual challenge, reasonably speaking. I mean, the course of study Irene was in and the course of study I was in were pretty serious academic topics.
I found in general that my education was just as good as the kids I know who went to Harvard and Yale and MIT and stuff like that. It just didn't have the name. It's a regional school.
It had a really great regional reputation. And we went to school there together for 2 years. And when I first met Irene, I met her, I think, in the cafeteria.
Yes.
And then we ended up going with your then boyfriend to a dance.
Right. Yeah, there was a dance going. It was a sock hop. Yep, it was a sock hop. And everybody tried to dress appropriately, find what you could, slick your hair back, do all the things that would have been appropriate for about 1955. And it was fun. Yeah, ancient history.
We got married. We got married in 1974, and I looked at how much it was costing to go to Furman and said, I can't afford to continue here, so I decided to apply to New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, which had a very good rating at that time in computer science, which was my intended major.
Well, it was the top 10 in the U.S.
It was great. It was a unique school because the school was very small, less than 1,000 students, a substantial number of which were returning graduate students, mostly people who were
a lot of Vietnam vets
out of the military.
Yeah, there were a lot of people there on the GI Bill sort of stuff.
But it was great because you had access to all kinds of machinery and welding equipment and facilities that you could do things.
Right, well, it was a really affordable school. I mean, it was the kind of school you could actually work your way through. Everyone worked. It was normal. There were very, very few kids who were there on a free dime.
The ones who were there in petroleum engineering, and they were mostly from Middle Eastern countries.
Yeah, those kids came on a dime. But they didn't generally live high.
No.
They may have had the ability to. In some cases, I know they did. But they just generally were part of the crew, so it didn't make you feel like you were oh, I can't compete with those people because they have a gazillion dollars, you know, sort of thing. You could walk around town. You could find crummy local jobs for crummy wages. And we did all kinds of stuff over the years too.
I think minimum wage then was $1.25 an hour.
By the time I worked at Tasty Freeze, it was $2 an hour. Because I made $2 an hour, but the high school kids were making... Because New Mexico was a depressed area, they had a special ability to provide a lower minimum wage, which to me makes absolutely no sense. If ever there was an area that needed more money, it was an area that was depressed. So I made $2 an hour. The kids from high school were on a special program, so they made $1.40 an hour, which of course is what we had both made when we worked in the cafeteria at Furman, because that was another thing where they get, I won't say free labor, but pretty darn close to free labor for their student employees. And then when I went to work for the Department of Interior, I got...
So this is also in New Mexico.
Yeah.
I was working at the Terminal Effects Research Activity, which was busy blowing things up.
Right, it did Department of Defense work.
And a lot of my work was digging holes with a shovel, digging trenches with a pick, using wrenches to put things together, take them apart. And my favorite job actually was walking across a big open field that we'd made flat, had line marks on the ground on an interval, and each
big grid.
Each one of those grids had a mark on it, and I handed students who were working on my crew paper bags, and their objective was to go pick up all the metal bits
in that square
and put them in the bag.
And that's how you graph the effects of an explosion.
Or that's how you did it then.
Yeah, well, I know this. The military and stuff still does it when they have an airplane that blows apart or something like that. Yes, they have pictures, if possible, but beyond the pictures comes the down to earth piecing up the whole thing. As literally, you'll hear about when there's been an airplane crash that they've picked up all the pieces and taken them to a warehouse someplace so they can be examined. It's the same concept.
It was a great place to work because I got an opportunity to expand some skills that I had. I had every kind of license that you can imagine to drive military equipment, so I could drive fire trucks and runway crash trucks and pickup trucks and 2.5-ton trucks and wreckers and
Cranes.
Everything that you can think of.
Right.
And that came in handy much later on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it was unique that way. Irene went to work. I'd been out of the hospital from an appendectomy for a very short period of time when we moved. I think I had my appendix out
They're over Easter, basically.
Easter break,
Yeah.
and then we got married and flew to New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And a week later, Irene went to work on a survey crew.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to work on a survey crew, and I've done surveying before because as an archaeologist you had to do surveying. And this was pretty basic stuff. Kind of boring, actually. I hate that kind of work, but it's much more interesting when you're actually doing this for archaeology because you're graphing specific locations, like, oh, you've got a ruin over here, and you're marking this and you're marking that. And when you're doing what they were doing, which is surveying land for mining claims, that's just boring. You're just creating a giant grid on a map, basically. So, but I worked for a day or two there, a couple of days there, I guess.
I think you worked more than a week.
I think I worked about a week, and then, most of us at that point had had enough and said bye and thanks for all the fish. And it took them, I don't know, a month or two to pay us. It was sort of ridiculous. But then I worked at assorted places. I was a barmaid. I worked at Tasty Freeze for a while. I worked in my favorite job ever was at the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. I got a seasonal employee job there. That was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. That was $2 44 cents or 45 cents an hour. I didn't know anyone made that kind of money.
It was more money than I was. It was more money than I was making
Yeah.
when I was working around explosives.
Yeah, but I had the correct educational level to make, was it E5 or something? I forget. Anyway.
GS5,
whatever
I think,
it was.
yeah.
Anyway, this is a million years ago. So yeah, I was thrilled to get the money, and it was fun. And you got to watch birds. And our goal was to actually protect the whooping cranes from the idiot tourists. And that's what we did all day, every day that we were out there, which was on the weekends. They had us there for the weekends so that the regular park rangers could have some time off because, you know, they have to have somebody's got to be on duty every day of the week.
Yeah, we lived in New Mexico for a few years, and I had insurance through the university that was supposed to include maternity insurance.
Right.
And our first child was in the oven, and I took my insurance policy to the providers and
Mom.
I took my insurance policy to the provider and said, my wife is pregnant, I want to start the prenatal care for her, and they said, oh, you're not covered.
Well, no, they were going to cover like $50,
We weren't covered.
which is a freaking joke even back then. So they had payment options through the doctors and stuff because very few people had insurance in those days.
So I decided at that point it was better to move back to South Carolina. Irene could go finish the one class that was hanging in the wind because she had an independent study that it took a long time to get the books for. In the meantime, her professor had left the university.
Right.
And she needed to go there to finish her degree. So we moved
I was
back to,
short one class.
Yeah, we moved back to South Carolina. And Irene sat in the class with the
Squished
professor.
in a chair.
And pregnant.
Yeah.
Very pregnant.
Yeah.
And
And
she-
finished.
And she was actually due right around when the class was due to be over.
Yeah.
And the professor was never so glad in all of his life.
When I heard in my filing, I guess his wife, the last baby that they had, barely made it to the hospital. So he had visions of me having the baby in class, but it was sort of funny.
While we were in New Mexico, we hunted for quail and rabbit in order to supplement our food on our table. We foraged for asparagus and prickly pears. And anything else.
Yeah, you could eat the acorns there with a little bit of help. They weren't that great, but pinon nuts. There were all kinds of odd bits and pieces you could get there.
Yeah, I think in a job in Reston, Virginia, working for a medical test equipment company, doing equipment for your eyes, measuring the prescription that was required for your eyes, measuring the prescription that was actually in your glasses. I was involved in all kinds of crazy projects, including at one point a doctor who was removing lenses from people's eyes, freezing them, grinding them, and then thawing them out and putting them back in the eye, which to me just didn't make a lot of sense, but for the time was a pretty advanced technique.
Right. It's basically the then equivalent of LASIK.
And so we spent time in Virginia, and it was interesting because first we lived in a real suburban setting.
Yeah, Reston.
And I spoke with a coworker and said, I'd like to find someplace further out. I knew they lived out in the country, and I said, we'd like to find someplace more in the country. And we connected with Mr. Thompson, who owned a large amount of land in Fauquier County.
That was a legacy sort of an environment. The family had been there since pre-Civil War sort of stuff, and we used to go to the estate house to pay our rent every month and stuff like that.
Mr. Thompson was a great guy. His wife, not so much.
Piece of work. Mean church lady. That's the way I would describe her.
That's a good way of putting it.
Mean church lady.
We had a goat that was in kid at the
Marlena.
time. Yeah. We had ducks that my father brought down from Maine. We fished in the pond and in order to have dinner sometimes. It was great.
Oh, the fish fries were great. I will never forget how much I've always loved to fish anyway. I grew up fishing on the ocean as a kid. And I was not accustomed to fishing in a pond, but it's pretty much the darn same thing, So it was just a lot of fun to do a whole fish until you had enough for dinner, and then just cook them up.
Yeah. Now the company that I worked for was in the process of being sold, unbeknownst to me. But I was working at that time with the vice president of the company, and he brought me into his office one day and said, "You don't own any stock in this company, do you?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't." He said, by that time I'd been promoted, and he said, "Well, how much of a future would you think you'd have as a department manager for an old line East Coast company if you were suddenly to find yourself working for them?" And I thought to myself, I know what this is about. And I had been working with a company out in California because we were using one of their products in our product.
Right.
And they'd been after me to come to work for them for quite some time. So I accepted a job offer. We moved to San Jose, California. Child in tow. Irene had spent time with our son on her back, on a backpack, getting firewood and cutting our Christmas tree and doing all the things that you need to do on a homestead because
we had one car.
And we lived on a 500-acre piece of land.
Yeah. So I would go out and cut firewood with the baby in a backpack.
Now,
seems like a sensible thing to do.
Our house originally started off as a cabin.
The kitchen was a one-room log cabin, and then they added on
3 rooms.
Yeah, well, 4. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a living room. And the bedrooms were totally unheatable in the wintertime. Summertime they were great, but wintertime you couldn't heat them. So we all just slept in the living room. It's okay.
So we also hunted there, and we learned a lot about a more rugged, more rural lifestyle. It was fun. It was not always easy, but it was educational.
And it wasn't forever.